Statements. People tend to believe that narcissists are emotionally empty, that when they wound someone through lies, abandonment, mind games, or deliberate harshness, statements, they simply walk away untouched. There's a common assumption that they rest easily while the other person is left replaying memories, doubting reality, statements, or grieving what was lost. That belief feels neat and reassuring, but it doesn't actually reflect what's happening beneath the surface. Statements. The truth is far more layered and psychologically revealing. A narcissist is not devoid of feelings at all. In fact, they are flooded with them. Statement, just not in a healthy or recognizable way. Their entire identity is organized around avoiding emotions they cannot tolerate, like deep shame, inadequacy, statements, and exposure. When they cause harm, it isn't an act of inner confidence. It comes from an unstable emotional core. Instead of facing that instability, statements, they manufacture an image. They present themselves as untouched, unbothered, almost immune. That appearance of having no remorse isn't accidental, statements, and it isn't only meant for the people they hurt. It's mainly there to convince themselves. Statements. Acknowledging regret or guilt would mean accepting responsibility, statements. And responsibility would immediately awaken the shame they've been running from their whole lives, statements. This avoidance system is what psychologists describe as narcissistic defense. It's not a structure built from self-assurance, but from terror. Statements. Terror of being seen clearly, terror of being flawed, terror of being wrong. That's why they behave as though your pain is irrelevant. The blank stare, statements, the dismissive silence, the subtle arrogance, all of it is theater. And that performance exists because the alternative would be unbearable, statements, sitting with the damage they've caused. For someone with narcissistic traits, self-reflection on that level feels like psychological collapse, statements. It threatens the balance they rely on to function. So what does that mean for you, the person who was deceived, used, or discarded? Statements. It means the idea that they erased you instantly is incomplete. They haven't truly moved on. They remain psychologically tied, statements, not through care or affection, but through their need to feel dominant, in control, and untouchable, statements. The unsettling truth is that they must convince themselves they are unaffected by what they did to you, statements, because that belief is the only way they can live with themselves. When you look deeper, you don't find someone free of conscience, statements. You find someone desperately avoiding it. Narcissists often carry guilt in a split-off form, buried and fragmented, statements, surfacing only briefly when their defenses weaken. When it does appear, they quickly smother it with justifications, statements. They tell themselves you were overreacting, that you forced their hand, that circumstances left them no option. These stories aren't only told outwardly, statements. They're internal narratives designed to keep their ego from shattering. This explains why sincere apologies are so rare. A real apology demands humility, statements. It requires recognizing another person as real and admitting responsibility for their suffering. For a narcissist, that level of honesty feels dangerous, statements. It invites shame they don't know how to survive, so they choose denial, emotional distance, and hostility instead. You might ask why, statements, if they are so distressed inside, they don't seek help or change their behavior. That question assumes they are equipped to face reality. Most aren't, statements. Doing so would require dismantling the false self they've spent years building. It would mean releasing the fantasy of superiority, control, statements, and emotional invincibility. When your identity depends on illusion, truth doesn't feel healing. It feels like destruction, statements. That's why transformation is uncommon. Remaining in familiar dysfunction feels safer than stepping into accountability. They hurt others, statements, then rewrite history. They witness tears, then ridicule them. Not because they lack awareness, statements, but because acknowledging another's humanity would force them to confront their own. And that confrontation is exactly what they avoid, statements. Here's what you need to hold on to. Their behavior is not evidence of strength. Their silence is not peace. Their coldness is not clarity. Their indifference is not freedom. It is a mask carefully maintained. And no mask, no matter how convincing, changes what's underneath. Statements. If you were harmed by a narcissist, understand this: something does register after the damage is done. It may be fear, resentment, envy, or buried guilt. Statements. But it will never be openly admitted. Often it isn't even consciously acknowledged. That's the contradiction at the heart of narcissism. Statements, the more harm they cause, the more aggressively they deny its impact, not because they feel nothing, statements, but because they feel too much and lack the capacity to process it. Don't mistake quiet for resolution. Don't mistake arrogance for power, statements. And don't assume that the absence of an apology means there was no internal cost. On some level, they know. And that awareness, however deeply hidden, statements, weighs on them more than they will ever show. They wear emotional numbness like armor, but beneath it, they are injured too, wounded not by your opinion, statements, but by what they see when they glimpse themselves. What makes this even more painful is that you likely never anticipated it. Statements, people who lead with empathy usually don't. We expect closeness to mean mutual care, encouragement, and respect. With a narcissist, it often works in reverse. The more genuine, open, and alive you are, the more threatened they feel. Slowly, they begin to erode you. Statements. Sometimes it's obvious, other times it's subtle. A dismissive glance when you speak honestly. Humor that leaves a sting. Statements. Emotional withdrawal when you accomplish something meaningful. None of this is accidental. Statements. These are calculated responses from someone unsettled by your authenticity. And here's the bitter paradox. While they attempt to diminish you, statements, they also draw energy from you. They resent your emotional depth while simultaneously feeding on it. They want the comfort, insight, and stability you offer without ever reciprocating. And the moment they sense you're becoming aware of this imbalance, statements that you're reclaiming clarity and independence, their envy intensifies. Now you don't just have what they lack, you also have the awareness to leave. Statements. That's the real danger in their eyes. So they escalate. They may pull you back with exaggerated affection and empty promises, or they may become harsher. Statements hoping to break your resolve before you fully detach. Either response comes from the same source, envy, not apathy, not detachment. Statements, a hidden craving for qualities they cannot produce themselves. Once you understand this, everything shifts. Statements. Their behavior stops being about your shortcomings and starts being about their inability to handle your strength. That was never your responsibility. Statements. You were never meant to make yourself smaller so someone else could feel whole. You were never required to dull your light because it exposed their emptiness. They may have tried to convince you that your sensitivity was a flaw. Statements, that your openness made you weak. In reality, it was your power. It was the one real thing in a dynamic built on falsehoods. Statements. The fact that it provoked envy in someone emotionally hollow only confirms its value. Hold on to that, especially when the quiet makes you doubt yourself. Statements. Especially when their detached act makes you question whether you mattered. You did, and you still do. Enough to stir emotions they couldn't manage. Statements. Envy doesn't arise from absence, it arises from abundance. And if there's one truth worth keeping, it's this. Statements. The qualities they resented in you are exactly what the world needs more of. Don't conceal them, respect them, live through them. Let them guide you. Statements. Not toward isolation, but toward people who will never ask you to dim yourself just to soothe their insecurity. And if this perspective resonates with you, statements, subscribe my channel. Another deeply misunderstood element of narcissistic behavior is their harshness, manipulation. Statements and post-conflict silence are not signs of emotional independence or confidence. They aren't proof that they've transcended the situation or forgotten you. Statements, they are symptoms of panic driven by an intense fear of losing control. Often this fear operates beneath awareness. They don't consciously label it. Statements. But their actions expose it. At the center of narcissistic injury is an overwhelming need to control the emotional narrative, to decide what's real. Statements. What's valid and what you're allowed to feel. When you stop reacting as expected, when you reclaim your identity. Statements. Their internal structure begins to destabilize. For them, control isn't just practical. It's existential. It holds their personality together. Statements. Without dominance over others, they risk facing their own inadequacy. So when they hurt you and you don't fall apart. Statements. When you show resilience or emotional distance, it doesn't empower them. It terrifies them. In their internal script, you were supposed to remain broken. Statements. To chase their approval, to doubt yourself endlessly. Your strength disrupts that script, and that disruption is something they cannot tolerate. statements. The pattern that keeps them in power is built on harm followed by emotional reliance. As long as that loop stays intact, they feel safe. Statements, but the instant you disrupt it, even in a quiet or indirect way, something inside them starts to unravel. Their anxiety doesn't always show up the same way. Statements. In some cases, it explodes as anger. In others, it slips out through cold silence or subtle hostility. And sometimes it presents as an unsettling stillness. Statements, as if nothing touched them at all. That stillness is deceptive. Underneath it lies panic, because once they can no longer shape how you see yourself, statements. Once they fail to provoke the reactions they depend on, their sense of control collapses. And when control disappears, so does their sense of identity. Statements. They don't know who they are without someone else orbiting around their influence. This is where the deeper truth comes into focus. Statements. What's actually happening is the breakdown of a manufactured persona. The narcissist constructs a version of themselves that must always appear dominant. Statements. Elevated, untouchable. As long as the people around them can play, that illusion can survive. But the moment someone steps out of line, statement, stops responding on cue, or begins to grow beyond them, the structure cracks. Statements. They are forced to face a world where they are no longer directing the performance. For someone who ties their value to authority over others, statements, that realization is devastating. You may have witnessed this shift firsthand. Perhaps as you became more confident, they tightened their grip. Statements. Maybe when you started saying no, their behavior became unpredictable or emotionally chaotic. That reaction isn't coincidence. Statements. It's fear wearing the mask of power. A grounded, secure person doesn't feel endangered by another's independence. Statements. They don't feel compelled to suppress growth. They encourage it. But a narcissist experiences your progress as defiance. To them, statements, your evolution feels like abandonment or betrayal. And when they sense you slipping out of reach, statements, they often escalate manipulation in an attempt to pull you back into the old dynamic. That effort to control isn't always about love or reconciliation. Often it has nothing to do with wanting you close. It's about ownership. It's about making sure you're still emotionally responsive. Statements, still psychologically engaged, still revolving around them in some way. As long as you react, they remain relevant. The moment you become indifferent, statements, they lose more than influence, they lose significance, and that loss is intolerable to them. This is where your clarity becomes your strength. Statements. When you understand that their actions come from insecurity rather than confidence, you stop taking their cruelty personally. You stop seeing their behavior as proof that something is wrong with you. Instead, statements, you recognize it as a frantic attempt to preserve dominance in a connection they never knew how to nurture with care. Statements. You see that their obsession with control is a prison of their own making, one they tried to pull you into, and that realization frees you. Statements. It means you no longer have to chase approval, perform for acceptance, or twist yourself into something smaller to keep the peace. Statements. The struggle ends the moment you stop participating. When you step away, you reclaim what they feared losing most, your autonomy. Statements. You were never meant to be managed or emotionally governed by someone threatened by your strength. You are here to become whole, to rise not in opposition, statements, but in self-ownership, and the irony is unmistakable. The power they clung to was never theirs. It belonged to you all along. Statements. Now you take it back with awareness, not revenge. If this insight is helping you, subscribe my channel and stay connected. Statements. There is another layer to their inner world that often confuses those they hurt. Narcissists do experience guilt, statements, but it doesn't function in a healthy or recognizable way. It isn't conscious or integrated. It doesn't lead to accountability or repair. Instead, statements, it exists as something fractured and buried, an emotional residue they refuse to acknowledge. Lacking the emotional capacity to face it, statements, they push it outward, they assign it to you. This explains why their lack of remorse feels so unsettling. Statements. You wonder how someone could cause such pain and appear unaffected. But that question assumes they are capable of processing guilt in the first place. Their psychology is built to avoid that experience entirely. True guilt requires openness. It demands the willingness to admit harm, to feel its weight, statements, and to take responsibility. That process is uncomfortable, but it's also how people grow and change. The narcissist avoids it because acknowledging fault would shatter the illusion they rely on. Statements. To admit wrongdoing would mean confronting their own limitations and capacity for harm. For someone invested in appearing superior, statements that awareness is unbearable. So instead, they distort reality, they deny events, they recast themselves as the injured party. Statements. They accuse you of the very behaviors they displayed. These reactions aren't just tactics, they're protective reflexes. On some level, statements, they do sense the damage they caused. It isn't always clear or verbalized, but it exists as an internal disturbance. That unprocessed guilt creates tension, statements, which fuels their defensiveness and volatility. Their anger isn't only about what's happening around them, statements, it's about what they're trying to keep buried inside. Every boundary you enforce, every truth you stand in threatens to expose what they refuse to face. Statements. You become a reflection they can't tolerate, not because they don't recognize what's there, but because they do. And it frightens them. Statements. This is why closure rarely comes from them. You seek acknowledgement, understanding, some sign that your pain mattered. Statements. They avoid that reckoning at all costs. Not because empathy is entirely absent, but because they've trained themselves to suppress it to protect their ego. Statements. Guilt threatens that structure, so it must be denied. The tragedy is that avoidance doesn't erase guilt, it transforms it. It becomes resentment disguised as superiority. It turns into chronic dissatisfaction and restlessness. Many narcissists live in constant agitation, statements, endlessly searching for validation that never satisfies. Their lives may look polished on the surface, but internally there is erosion. Statements. Each betrayal deepens the emptiness they refuse to confront. Understanding this shifts something vital for you. Their silence does not mean they were untouched. Their refusal to apologize does not mean your pain was insignificant. It means they are afraid. Statements. That guilt they won't name will follow them unresolved. But you are not obligated to carry it. You can acknowledge the truth, grieve the harm, statements, and release the blame. You don't need their confession to heal. Their fear doesn't have to confine you. Let them avoid the mirror if they must. Statements. You can look into it and reclaim your strength. Because the guilt they hide is proof that what you experienced was real, that you mattered. Statements. And that despite their denial, their conscience is not gone, only afraid. Finally, what often looks like confidence in them is anything but. Statements. The smug expression, the detached posture, the strategic silence can give the impression of emotional immunity. But this is a misinterpretation. That composure is a shield. Beneath it is insecurity so fragile it cannot withstand honesty or vulnerability. Narcissists are not grounded, statements. They are evasive, they are running from shame and the fear of being exposed as less than the image they project. The mask they wear is not strength, statements, it is survival. And when you begin to move on, to detach, to live freely, their indifference is not proof of victory. It is evidence of threat, statements. If they were to admit it even briefly, the image they've spent years protecting would begin to fracture. That image tells them they are invincible, statements, beyond criticism, incapable of being wounded, and therefore incapable of being wrong. But when you look beneath that surface, statements, something much deeper is going on. That hunger to appear superior doesn't come from strength, it comes from a very human terror, statements, the fear of being insufficient. At the core of many narcissistic personalities lies an early emotional injury. Somewhere along the way, through neglect, statements, trauma, or constant emotional pressure, they absorbed the belief that who they truly were was unlovable. That authenticity led to rejection, statements. So they adapted, they constructed a version of themselves meant to impress, to control, to avoid humiliation, and to secure admiration. Yet no mask, statements, no matter how polished, can erase the original wound. It remains buried quietly, shaping everything they do. Statements. That hidden insecurity is what drives their contempt, their manipulation, their harshness. It's not confidence holding them up, statements. It's fear desperately keeping them together. Their sense of self is brittle, always close to shattering. That's why even mild disagreement, statements, a lack of attention, or a simple boundary can provoke an extreme response. It's never about the moment itself. It's about what that moment represents, statements, a threat to the false identity they depend on. This becomes even more intense after they've harmed you. On some level, they are aware of what they've done. Statements. They know that if you fully recognize it, if you truly understand who they are, you may leave. And if you leave, the illusion collapses. Statements. So they exaggerate the act. Their smile turns colder, their tone sharpens, their emotional flatness becomes more pronounced. Statements. They behave as though they are unaffected, as though you meant nothing, as though they are untouchable. But that performance doesn't erase reality. Statements. They sense your withdrawal. They notice when your energy changes, when you stop engaging, when you begin to reclaim yourself. Statements. Instead of facing the loss honestly, they hide behind arrogance, because remorse, accountability, statements, or vulnerability would require confronting the very emptiness they've spent their entire life avoiding. Ironically, this avoidance is what traps them. Statements. They may win arguments, but they lose bonds. They may dominate situations, but they remain emotionally alone. Statements. They guard their ego at the cost of genuine closeness. The sarcasm, the smirk, the calculated calm they rely on doesn't protect them. Statements. It walls them off from the connection they secretly crave but refuse to acknowledge. When you understand this, something shifts in you. Statements. You stop seeking their approval. You stop mistaking their silence for strength. Statements. You stop personalizing their smugness because you recognize it as insecurity disguised as control, not power. And in that awareness, statements, you begin to take your power back. Seeing them clearly changes everything. Not seeing them as villains, statements, but as deeply insecure individuals armored in emotional defenses. You stop trying to fix them, statements. You stop chasing compassion from someone incapable of offering it. Instead, you turn your attention inward, statements. You begin healing the part of you that believed the act, the part that interpreted emotional distance as superiority, the part that kept giving statements, hoping one day they would finally show care. They won't. Not in the way you need. Not in a way that allows mutual growth. Statements. Because that would require vulnerability, honesty, and surrendering control. And that is something they simply cannot tolerate. So let them keep the mask. Statements. Let them pretend they're above it all. You choose clarity, you choose depth, you choose growth. Statements. The strength they imitate is the strength you are genuinely developing. And that truth, though they'll never confess it, is yours to live. Statements. One thing deeply unsettles them, even though it's hidden beneath cruelty, arrogance, and silence. After the manipulation, after the damage, statements. There is one outcome that terrifies them more than any confrontation. You might actually detach, not just leave physically, but emotionally disconnect. Statements. To stop caring about their approval, to stop reacting to their moods, to stop being pulled by their presence or absence. That is their greatest fear. Statements. It's not love driving that fear, it's dependence. You were never just a partner or a person to them. You were a reflective surface, a source of validation. Statements. A tool they use to stabilize their inflated self-image. When you stop reflecting back what they want to see, when you disengage from the dynamic, statements, they begin to unravel. At first, they hide it well, they act indifferent, they appear to move on effortlessly, they present themselves as thriving. Statements. But that display isn't confidence, it's protection against the fear of becoming irrelevant. They will never openly admit this, but they needed you. Statements. Not in a healthy, reciprocal way, but in a consuming way. You were the one who reacted, who tried, who forgave, who cared. Statements. Your emotional investment convinced them they mattered. When that energy disappears, it creates a void. Statements. And that void is unbearable because it forces them to face a possibility they've avoided all their lives without control, without admiration. Statements. They feel empty. That emptiness defines their inner world. It isn't calm or self-aware, it's hollow. Statements. And it exists because they sacrificed authenticity for performance. They invested everything in appearances and power while neglecting their true self. Statements. When you leave emotionally as well as physically, they are left alone with that hollowness, and no performance can fill it. Statements. This doesn't mean they'll return with genuine remorse. Most won't, because that would require confronting shame and responsibility. Statements. But it does mean your absence deeply unsettles them, not because they miss you as a person, but because your healing threatens their identity. Statements. They fear your clarity. They fear the moment you realize their treatment doesn't define your worth, that their voice doesn't determine your value. Statements. that their presence was not essential but limiting. When you no longer need them for answers, closure, or validation, you become free. Statements. Free from them and from the psychological grip they tried to maintain. Your healing becomes powerful. Every time you choose peace instead of engagement, silence instead of defense, self-respect instead of explanation, you dismantle the illusion they relied on. Statements. You prove to yourself that you are not their extension. You are whole. You are sovereign. You are capable of growth and transformation. Statements. They feel that shift even if they never admit it. Your wholeness exposes their fractures. Your independence reveals their reliance. Statements. Your freedom proves their control was never absolute. This is why distance works. Not as revenge, but as truth. You don't disengage to provoke a reaction. Statements. You disengage to return to yourself. Along that path, you stop seeking understanding from someone who avoids reality. Statements. You stop chasing closure from someone who fears truth, and you begin building a life that doesn't include them, not from bitterness, but from self-respect. Statements. If this insight resonates with you and helps you reclaim your clarity and strength, subscribe my channel and continue choosing yourself.